It's good to have everyone here today to talk about these issues with biosecurity in the Australian production nursery industry. It's certainly been a challenging few years, as I think John would certainly contest to, but it's great to have CSIRO as part of this project. So we're going to start fairly soon for any of the attendees that have just recently joined us. So as you join us, if you want to just use the chat function and let us know where you're located today and maybe a couple of words about your interest in this topic. So we've got a couple of attendees here now. So as I said, if you want to just write in your name in the chat and where you're located at the moment, and you'll let us know what your interest is. We're fortunate enough today to have David Hunt monitoring the chat for us. So as I said before, we'll be starting off in a few minutes on this, looking at some of the social and economic findings out of the research reports that CSIRO has been doing under this project funded through Hort Innovation. So we'll be starting this in about 1 minute time. If you just joined us for this webinar, you are very welcome, and I hope you get a lot out of it today. And just write your name in the chat. We've got David monitoring the chat for us today, the chat box, which we'll use today, and you can make comments throughout the session. We'll have time for Q&A and chat midway through the program and then at the end as well. And good morning if you just joined us. This is a roundtable discussion on some of the research findings that we've had in the project for the Australian production nursery industry, funded through the industry levy and through Hort Innovation. So if you've just joined us, we will start very soon. Just waiting for a few more people to join us before we kick off. So we're going to be using the chat function today. So you're welcome to use that. Let us know where you're located today and maybe a few words about what your interest is in this topic. And you're welcome to use that function. We've got David Hunt monitoring that chat box for us today. So yeah, thank you, David. So we'll start in about 30 seconds time, guys. I will just point out that this session is being recorded, so it will be put up on our website. So Hope you find it useful, but you will have access to it later on as well if there's any items that you miss in the presentation. All right, well, I think we might kick off, if that's all right. Our panelists are ready. So hello and welcome to our roundtable discussion on the socio-economic impacts of a biosecurity incursion on the Australian production nursery industry. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Kerry Battersby, and I'm the Industry Recovery and Resilience Manager at Nursery and Garden Industry, Queensland. Today's webinar is being recorded and will run for just under 1 hour. A copy of the webinar will be available to you in the next few days, so check your inbox for that copy of the video. We've allocated time for questions and comments midway through the presentation and again at the end. So please write your questions or comments in the chat box. In fact, if you want to let us know now about where you're located and perhaps your interest in this topic, please put a few words in there now. We have David Hunt from Green Life Industry Australia monitoring the chat today. So thank you, David, for volunteering to do that job. Our panelists today are from Australia's National Science Agency, CSIRO, Barton Loschel and Liz Hobman. We also have joining us John McDonald, who is the National Biosecurity Manager at Green Life Industry Australia, and of course, David Hunt with us today from Green Life Industry Australia. So we'll predominantly have a slideshow presentation for you, and we'll look at the learnings, and that we've really decided this is a good discussion to have. So rather than a formal presentation as such, we'll talk and discuss about the findings that CSIRO has done with as part of the project. So let's move to the next slide. Let me talk a little bit about this project. The project is entitled Supporting Production Nursery Businesses During a Biosecurity Incursion, the Social and Economic Research Findings for the Australian production nursery industry. But what's its objective? The project objective is really to assess the risk of biosecurity incursions to generate severe economic, social, or indeed emotional consequences on the individual nursery owner and the business. Management processes should not only be about managing ecological risks and adhering to regulatory processes, but the social and economic dimensions associated with an incursion. So we've looked at things like risk assessment. We've looked at how a nursery could review their management processes to perhaps better manage a potential incursion. We've looked at how to identify support systems within the industry and within the businesses themselves. And finally, we've developed a business continuity framework to enable nursery businesses to better prepare for an incursion and how to better manage their processes. So having identified the risks, being dropped into it during an incursion, what can you actually do? So today, I think we'll find that preparation is a key word out of all of this. So the intended outcome of all of this project is for the nursery industry to ensure there's a continuity framework. It can be applied during biosecurity incursions with looking at the social and economic research learnings that CSIRO has done. This gives us better preparedness, a better response, recovery, resumption and restoration of business activities. This project is funded by Hort Innovation using the Nursery Industry Research and Development Levy and contributions from the Australian Government. For those who don't know, Hort Innovation is the grower-owned, not-for-profit research and development corporation for Australian horticulture. So we certainly thank the industry and Hort Innovation for their support of this project. So why do we need to do this? Because there's a lack of publicly available information on impacts on the production nursery industry in Australia. And our desired outcome is, after all, a better informed industry and government, and who are better prepared, both industry and government, to respond and support growers during an incursion. So what's today all about? It's about presenting the key findings from the research, discussing the potential impacts and support measures available to nursery operators, and then at the end, we'll run through 3 practical scenarios or situations that growers can apply to their own business. So talking further about the project, this is what we've done to date. So CSIRO, who's been the main research lead on the program, has produced a literature review as one of the first deliverables. Today, we'll talk about the interviews and the survey that they conducted with industry participants. Then we'll run through 3 scenario exercises or situations that growers could apply to their own business. And then we'll look ahead at the business continuity management framework that has been developed through this project and also one of the other Hort Innovation funded projects. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Liz to start and share with us the insights for the survey. Thanks, Liz.
Thank you, Kerry. So my name's Elizabeth Hobman, and I'm a research scientist at CSIRO. And on this project, I worked with Barton Local, and with him, we conducted this research to, as Kerry just described, to specifically examine growers' experiences with biosecurity incursions with a view to better understand how growers are actually impacted and to gather ideas on how they could be better supported through an incursion. Today, we'll be presenting just some of the few top-level findings, but it's worth noting that there are 2 in-depth reports that have been prepared, which provide even more information and greater insights into grower experiences. And those will be used by Kerry in developing the business continuity management plan framework. So to give you a brief overview of what we actually did, we first conducted 31 interviews with growers and stakeholders from the industry. And in these interviews, we selected 5 case study incursions to guide the discussions. So these included myrtle rust, banana freckle, cucumber green mottle mosaic virus, tomato, potato psyllid, and citrus canker. And Bart really took carriage of the interview component. Participants in these interviews, participants were asked about the impacts that growers experienced during the incursions and then the actions that could have actually helped them better manage and survive that incursion. In the next phase, from those interviews, Bart and I then co-designed a telephone survey with a broader random sample of 80 growers to gain a more representative assessment of growers' experiences and perceptions. Next slide, Kerry. Thank you. Okay, so we'll just be talking about the priority top-level findings today. So across the interviews and telephone survey, we collected data from a total of 41 participants who had been affected by a biosecurity incursion. In the case of the interviews, there were 9 growers who had been directly impacted by an incursion. And in the case of survey participants, 32 of the 80 surveyed had either been directly impacted themselves or they experienced indirect impacts that flowed from restrictions placed on another business in their supply chain. Interestingly, when we asked survey participants whether they knew of any other nurseries that had been impacted, 44 growers were not aware of any other business that had been impacted. And then of those 44, 34 also hadn't personally experienced an incursion themselves. So this equates to around 43% of the entire sample who were not personally impacted themselves, and nor did they know of anyone else impacted. Perhaps this relatively low awareness of and personal experience with incursions might partly explain an additional result we found was that participants felt that the likelihood of experiencing an incursion in the future, in the next 12 months, was relatively low, averaging only a 30% chance. Yet the majority, 80%, actually reported that if an incursion did indeed occur, the impacts would be moderately to extremely negative. So based on these findings, it would seem that participants view incursions as a relatively low likelihood or chance event. It's not likely to happen to them, but if it did happen, it would be highly impactful. And I think John might talk about that at the intermission stage. In terms of impacts now, one of the broader level findings was that the impacts of a biosecurity incursion could be broadly categorized into 3 areas. Those operational types of impacts, which self-explanatory, it refers to changes in how the nursery conducts its everyday businesses. Economic or financial, which refers to financial losses or additional expenditure and costs associated with managing the incursion. And social impacts, which refer to relationships with other businesses, the reputation of the business, as well as more personal emotional impacts such as perceived stress and ability to cope in managing the incursion. Interestingly, Barton found that with the interviews, when they were explaining these impacts, they tended to describe that there was sort of a flow of impacts where everything seemed to stem from those operational changes, and then from there it would have an economic impact and or a social impact in turn. And today I'll be talking a little bit about the operational and economic impacts, and then I'll hand over to Bart to talk about those social impacts and the social supports that people thought could have helped them. So first of all, taking a deeper dive into these types of impacts, when it came to operational impacts, interviewees tended to talk about what I've listed there, those following types of changes. As you can see, it mainly included changes within the nursery itself, such as restricting the movement of plants, people and vehicles, to other more administrative tasks, such as preparing records and compliance documents. Among survey participants, we didn't go into great depth on the specific types of operational impacts. However, of the 32 growers who were impacted, either directly or indirectly, the majority indicated that they had a restriction or requirement placed upon them by government, which could be a biosecurity zone enforced, or in a few cases, they were placed under quarantine. And some participants also experienced those flow-on effects from another business being restricted in some way. In terms of economic impacts, so we provided a list of potential economic impacts that they could have experienced, and those that were more commonly mentioned are listed here. So they included increased costs and workload requirements, as well as reduced trade and stock losses. Finally, we attempted to delve even deeper into understanding those economic impacts by asking growers to quantitatively estimate 3 aspects. So here we asked them about the cost or the average outlay in managing the incursion, the value of plant stock and or equipment that had to be destroyed. Thank you, Kerry. And the average annual income lost as a result of the incursion. So on all of these 3 sort of financial factors, we found that the distribution was positively skewed, and all that really means is that most participants tended to cluster around the lower end of the scale, but there were a few very high level values at the upper end. So for example, here with average outlay, the average cost among the 32 growers was around $15,500, but this dropped to $8,000 when one business was excluded who reported $200,000 average outlay. And the average value of plant stock and or equipment was around $98,000, though again, when one business was excluded, that dropped to $40,000. And the average annual income was 4.6, but again, that was this positive skew that we observed. So it seemed, looking at that sort of positively skewed distribution, that significant economic impacts associated with managing an incursion may be confined to fewer businesses. Yet growers also reported other economic costs as a result of the incursion, and the most commonly mentioned costs were loss of customers or markets, and also stock sold at a discounted price. Relatedly, there seemed to be wide variability in the length of time the business was significantly affected by the incursion, with some saying just a couple of weeks, while others were saying it was up to 20 years, which is a very long time. And interestingly, 1/3 of growers actually indicated that their business is still experiencing the effects of the incursion. So I might just hand over to Bart to talk more about those social impacts, which are very interesting to sort of unpack. And he also will introduce some of the supports that people thought could be implemented in the industry. Thank you, Barton.
Okay, thanks, Liz. Yeah, so with the social impacts, as Liz mentioned, that there were different types. The four main types of impacts that I identified in the interviews were, again, from the operational demands, so work stress, extra work, different types of work involved with the actual incursion, and then again the financial stress from the economic impacts, and that was a key stressor. So some of those who said that they could handle the work, it was an annoyance. The financial stress was a major concern. And the other area of stress was that associated with uncertainty and unknowns, particularly in the early stages, but it could extend for some period, about the various facts of the incursion, what they were dealing with, what the nature of the pest, how it moved, and its relationship with the host, and also what it would mean for their business. And this was, and therefore what they should be doing, and more broadly, what was going on with the incursion response. So particularly in the early stages, some of this is inevitable in that even the authorities themselves are still trying to answer a lot of questions about what they're dealing with and so on, and what it's going to mean. So some of this can't be avoided, but there was a concern that sometimes a lack of clear information heightened the sense of uncertainty and stress associated with that. The fourth type of social stress that I identified was that related to dealing with others, so relationships. And of course, dealing with the authorities could be a form of stress in trying to get clear information and rapid up-to-date information, of course, but also some of the requirements that were required of growers. And the other form of stress there was with peers. So, and that related to the broader industry. So some growers felt that they were unfairly blamed for an incursion that may have blown in on the wind or whatever. There was feelings of stigma associated. So feelings that when they were met with their peers, that they were in some sense ostracized, or again blamed for what was going on. Regarding the severity of the social impacts, there were a number of things that were detected there through interviews. Clearly, the magnitude of the financial impact had an effect on the severity of the social impact, but also the duration. For those where the incursion wore on for weeks, months, even over a year in some cases, that stress would accumulate. And again, the level of uncertainty, or the level or the amount of information that they needed that wasn't being supplied also affected the severity of the social impact. So if we just go to the next slide, Kerry. Yeah, so with the survey that we did, we also investigated stress, and we found that the stress reactions varied quite largely there. Again, it's to do with, there seemed to be a small number of participants who had experienced a severe incursion, but many of the participants hadn't really seemed to experience a severe incursion. So it's like typical of a low likelihood but high impact event. So around half rated their overall incursion experience as being not at all or only a little stressful, and those and a fifth rated their experiences very to extremely stressful. So clearly those ones that were more associated with greater financial impact or greater effect on their business would have, which was only a small proportion of them, would have experienced that greater stress. And when we looked specifically at financial stress as one of the stresses, about a quarter experienced moderate to overwhelming stress. So that was moderate stress, very stressed, or overwhelmingly stressed. Whereas the remainder, which is 3/4 of them, reported none or very little financial stress. So again, that was that larger group that weren't greatly affected. Regarding the capacity to cope, most, approximately 70%, reported feeling able to cope and on top of the situation. So that, that accords very well with that 75% who reported very little stress. But we also provided a hypothetical example of an incursion and asked how they felt they would be able to deal with that, or their level of confidence in dealing with that. Now, the majority felt moderately to very confident in their ability to manage the situation and be able to continue trade throughout an incursion. However, that was an interesting result when we also asked a follow-on question asking about how much in control of their ability to trade that they felt. And in that case, 65 recognised that the ability to trade through an incursion was somewhat to entirely out of their control. In other words, it's in the control of the authorities about whether they would be able to trade, or the situation of the incursion, which comes back to what the authorities decide whether what trade is allowable or not. And so if we keep going to the next slide, thanks, Carrie. So then we look at what support measures could be put in place. So this was an important area, saying, okay, these are the types of stresses, these are the types of impacts, what can be done to help you? And we identified 3 kind of main areas. Those actions that could be taken by growers, by industry, or by government. Now, there was some crossover between industry and government, and some of those actions or responsibilities are an ongoing conversation between industry and government as far as providing support measures to growers. A key theme for all those 3 groups was the importance of preparedness, being prepared for an incursion. Now, as far as for growers, a key factor for preparedness was general biosecurity preparedness. So how well are they prepared with regards to biosecurity generally, not just for the specifics of what to do when an incursion hits, but how to prevent an incursion. But then again, there's a specific preparedness for a biosecurity incursion. And that's issues around, well, do you have a plan for if a biosecurity incident affected your business, what could you do? And the other aspect that came out that was important, and that was the need for a support network, specifically those knowledgeable people, people who understand what happens during a biosecurity incursion, or people who are knowledgeable about the pest, and being able to talk to those people and access those people, whether they're in government or industry or peers. Another important aspect for what growers can do is that was put forward was just generally having a mature and professional approach to business management. So that again really revolved mainly around risk management, having professional risk management approach, in addition to the more specific biosecurity management, and other aspects of business management, such as good record keeping, knowing the processes involved in your business, and various aspects of your business well. The other thing that came through quite strongly in the interviews was the idea that when during an incursion, what can growers do? And it came through quite strongly that there's a need for proactive engagement by the grower. Don't leave it up to the, they felt that they couldn't really leave it up to others to provide what they needed. They needed to be proactively engaging with government, with industry people, with their peers, anyone who could help them. So that support network to provide them the information, the guidance that they needed, because sometimes early in incursion, particularly, there's a lack of information, and there's a lot of jobs to do, and so industry bodies and government can be focused on those aspects of the response, and growers need to be looking at it themselves as well, which of course they are. The survey results, as far as what growers can do, we asked them the question what they felt in the survey. So this was those growers. This question was asked of all growers. And again, they said be aware of and perform best practice biosecurity. That was one thing. Keep their staff educated and informed and well trained. Adhere to the industry standards and government regulations, and access expertise through their networks. So that access to expertise came through there again. So then if we go to the next slide, Kerry, we asked, okay, what could industry and government do? And I suppose one of the strong things that came out there was providing that information that's so important to growers. Information, tools, good communication, and expertise for growers at the time of an incursion. And particularly that came through strongly there was the need for rapid supply of that information as much as is possible. And so that comes back again to being well prepared, so that the necessary information can be provided as early as possible and up to date as possible throughout the incursion. The other thing that came through very strongly of the importance for government was including industry in response planning. Now, industry, of course, is included in response planning of an incursion. However, it was noted that this is, well, strongly noted that this is really important. And the other thing is that there's one of the key challenges that came through was the balancing of the needs of disease control with a rapid return to trade. So that is an area where you've got those growers who want to return to trade as quickly as possible, yet the authorities and industry are really concerned with the actual purpose of the response, which is to reduce spread of the disease. So there was comments that came out in that regard of the importance of evidence and risk-based approaches in dealing with that. So making decisions based on good evidence and risk assessments of that would allow return to trade. More broadly, there was system level incursion preparedness, such as development of biosecurity standards and protocols that came through strongly, particularly with interstate trade, that could bring return to trade there more quickly. There was talk about compensation schemes or greater, say, expanding the owner reimbursement cost scheme or insurance, and to a lesser extent, social supports. There weren't many suggestions that we detected in terms of what could be done to combat blaming, stigma, and ostracism in the industry. However, some interviewees did make a note that there needed to be, or it would be valuable to have social psychological support. So, yeah. Thanks, Kerry. So when we asked in the survey, asked growers in the survey what government and nursery industry association could do. For government, they suggested improving and streamlining communication so that around providing information quickly, consulting more with industry, which previously detected in the interviews, providing more financial and technical support. So that's relating to that technical expertise there at least, but also forms of financial support, and acting quickly and efficiency. So that's that rapid supply, relates to that rapid supply of information, particularly in the early stages of the incursion. Comments about what the Nursery Industry Association could do further. Really, the respondents seemed quite happy with the actions of the Nursery Industry Association in terms of biosecurity. So maintaining their current role in disseminating and providing up-to-date information, continuing their current efforts with regards to biosecurity, and continuing to provide expert advice and support to members during the incursion. So that was quite heartening to see that most of the respondents were happy with the efforts of the industry association. So now what I might do is just hand over to John McDonald, who's a biosecurity manager with Green Life Industries Australia, who can just provide some reflections on what do these findings mean from his perspective for industry. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Bart. I'll just quickly cover off on a couple of the earlier areas before I get into the overall position, I think, from GIA and what we've been doing. I think one of the pleasing numbers I saw was the 30% of growers now feel that they will be affected by an incursion. 3 years ago, that was down as low as 8%. So I think from an industry's perspective, those numbers, I think, are showing industries paying more attention to what's going on around them. And obviously, we as industry are seeing more and more biosecurity impacts affecting the industry year on year. I think at the moment we're averaging around 40 odd new emergency plant pest incursions annually. The other area I wanted to quickly touch on was around the economic impacts. Just we need to be very, very aware how that flows at the moment. It really does depend on the pest host cropping system that businesses are operating in. As an example, if you had a pest affecting a citrus nursery, which generally only produces citrus, you're likely to have a significantly high economic impact as opposed to a ornamental tree and shrub grower that might be growing somewhere around 400 species, where you have a very narrow pest impact. The other one was the economic impact on industry is also significantly softened if a response plan is enacted, which then allows for owner reimbursement costs. If, however, a business, for example, is quarantined, which can be up to weeks, unable to trade while they determine if something is technically feasible or cost beneficial to eradicate, and they determine that not to be the case, no response plan is enacted, therefore the business can be significantly out of pocket. And we had one in, I think it was around 2018, that was over $1 million out of pocket in that exact scenario in Queensland. Other than that, what I would like to say is I firmly believe the work that this project has undertaken and then delivered gives us a high degree of confidence that what we are doing as industry, particularly in RD&E, and our efforts across the whole plant biosecurity spectrum are where we need to be. Certainly, it supports other reports that have been done. And Bart, as you know, and Elizabeth, the work you did back in 2018 under the Improving Grower-Led Surveillance case study, a lot of the information out of there has been also feeding into what industry and what we've been doing and where we've been putting our projects, where the levy investment is going. I think that needs to be significantly acknowledged, that what we are doing we are doing based on historical information feeding in to the programs. The current NY 2001 National Biosecurity and Sustainable Plant Production Program is heavily influenced on past surveys and information. This particular report validates so much of what we're doing, particularly around where we sit as developing up resources, providing information, communicating, etc., as that has come out of the survey. We are also continuously adapting and evolving our programs, particularly under the Australian Plant Production Standard, where we've got the NIASA Best Management Practice, EcoHort and Biosecure HACCP. We note certainly under the support measures so much on that particular page, not the last support, but the previous support measure page, where industry and government working together, that is achieved and is growing and improving continuously under the Emergency Plant Pest Response Deed, as well as our work with Plant Health Australia, who are the custodians of the deed. We work under a range of committees, if you like, with Plant Health Australia. We have the member forum where we engage it within industry and government engage, the Plant Industries Forum where industries work together, and then we've recently initiated the Plant Industries Biosecurity Committee, which is going to be taking us directly through into the National Plant Health Committee and engage at, again, another level. So taking on board so much of the information coming out from growers around what they'd like to see happening. We are moving, and I think we are taking steps in that direction to address so much more. We've also done quite a lot in relation to funding under the nursery levy to accommodate industry capability, capacity and information. The other area I think is this report is highlighting a couple of things that need to be, I think, looked at more closely within industry itself. There is a lot of self-belief around what industry is doing, running programs and extension on the ground. I know that we've got issues around industry's ability to maybe objectively evaluate exactly what they're doing and how they can improve. The levy is invested in so many of the areas that industry talk about, information, tools, communication, expertise. We have so much of that sitting there. And one of the things I get a little bit confused about is often we look at things that we need, which is based on not being implemented. We actually have those things. They're not necessarily being implemented across the industry, which we still need to work on. I think we also need to be very clear across industry in that we need to see industry adopting and integrating biosecurity into their plant protection systems so that it's not as a business as usual crop management process, as opposed to us continuously bringing it out as something different. Because in actual fact, it's not. A robust, well-structured plant protection program actually is a good biosecurity program and puts a business in biosecurity readiness. And we've got to get that message through to industry that that's how this works. We don't need to necessarily do a lot more different than what we're doing. And I think the other area is we need to see government and supply chains valuing the high health plant production programs. So valuing this within the supply chain, we need to see that value. And by that, where I'm coming from is we will move industry further along in so many of these areas where we can address some of those areas around the lack of certainty. That's always going to be difficult, as you noted at the beginning of an incursion. But if we're operating with approved programs, recognised and valued programs, so much of that uncertainty can be reduced. I'll leave it at that, and let Kerry take it on to the scenarios.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you, Bart and Liz. Before we move into looking at some of the situations that a grower might encounter, David, are there any questions for the panel? Anything coming up in the chat? Or we encourage you to put in some questions because we'll have a few minutes at the end to look at that. David?
At the moment, no questions have come through or comments. Anybody who wishes to make a comment or a question, please send them through via chat.
Thanks, David. Okay, so let's now take these learnings and we've heard from John his approach to what the industry can do, what resources it has there. But let's look at the concept of a scenario exercise. Now, many growers will know of a scenario in terms of, say, a fire evacuation exercise. It's similar to that. If you're in a bushfire zone or something, you'll probably do your annual bushfire exercise with your team members, and each one will have different functions, and you'll look at a risk assessment, you'll look at what you need in terms of resources and time to prepare for a situation like a bushfire, and then look at the possible consequences on the business of that particular disruption. So this is the purpose of the scenario exercise. And we've got 3 examples here using some of the themes that have come out of the research. So we're just going to go quickly through this, and this is more about exploring what if it would happen to your nursery business. So a lot of the research, we're running this in combination with a project on the nursery industry natural disaster risk mitigation and recovery plans. Under that project, we've developed a business continuity template, which is available for any nursery business. And we're applying that in this situation to a interruption to business because of a biosecurity incursion. So what's the purpose of this particular scenario exercise? It's really to explore your capacity to continue business operations, production cycles in the face of a disruption, in this instance, a biosecurity incursion. And of course, we're always about encouraging continuous improvement. And we believe that adopting a scenario exercise on a regular basis as part of a continuity framework can actually improve your ability to respond. And as we've heard, it's all about preparedness. Everyone wants to be well prepared for a situation. So in each of these 3 situations, we're going to look at how do you assess risk? How do you prepare? How long before a situation seriously impacts your production cycle or indeed your finances? And finally, what's your action plan to ensure that you have continuity of supply and you can continue to trade? So this is all about what if. So let's look at situation number 1. I can just move to that slide. There we go. Okay, so you may recall that Bart and Liz talked earlier about the uncertainty and the unknown impacts, especially early on in a biosecurity incursion. So what if there is an alert of a new host pest in your region that potentially affects 75% of your plant stock and access to markets? So how do you assess risk for your property in that situation? Maybe you've been in that, caught up where maybe 25% of your stock has been potentially affected because it's the type of species that you grow, and then your access to market has been cut off. How do you prepare for an incursion? Who do you contact? And how do you monitor for updates on the particular situation with government and with industry? How do you assess the feasibility to diversify and increase your remaining unaffected stock? Do you have access to new markets? Are you able to diversify? We'll look at that in a moment or two. So then we look at preparation and possible actions you could take. And again, this is about you asking yourselves these questions under this particular situation if you were to face it. What operational processes could you change? Who did you talk to as a possible action? Can you write down who you need to contact at that time? And have you determined what is the length of downtime acceptable before you're in financial difficulty or you cannot supply to customers? So on this one, I might just open this up to the panel to talk about the unknown and uncertain impacts of a biosecurity incursion. And perhaps, John, you might want to talk about, we know of maybe there's a chance to diversify your stock if you're impacted or if there's a threat. What's your impression on the ability of the industry to actually diversify?
It's an overvalued proposition, Kerry. Growers are specialists in what they do, and they set their businesses up to grow those products in the containers and the sizes of those containers, and they chase the markets that they're experts in. They're not experts in all markets, and this is important to acknowledge with the nursery sector, particularly highly diverse supply chains growing into ornamentals, landscape, fruit, vegetable, forestry, revegetation, sectors of horticulture. So you can't have a citrus nursery that's dedicated to growing citrus varieties for citrus farmers and expect them to pivot and supply the ornamental market. Number one, they're not growing the varieties necessarily that the ornamental market may want. But the other big one is there's already suppliers in that market that are got relationships with their retailers, for example, and our big retailers are forward ordering. Growers are growing to specify specific delivery schedules, etc., etc. It's an area that I just simply don't like to see. There are businesses that can potentially do that, but it's not a quick move. We witnessed that during the drought years in southeast Queensland back around 2010-11, even into 2012, even though the drought had broken, businesses were trying to pivot where the ornamental market was particularly hard. They moved into the landscape because we also had the GFC. So there was theoretically a lot of landscaping, but it took a significant amount of time for them to do that. So I don't subscribe to that diversification as being something that should be number one. I think the number one we should be looking at is business continuity from my position as servicing the industry. So our focus is on business continuity, and that means working with all parties in an incursion to get businesses back up and trading as quickly as possible. And that things around that, it's not just government. Industry's actually got to start to do a little bit more. We are under a higher risk profile today than we've ever been before, and that profile is not going to change. We've got increased travel, increased tourism, increased trade. We've never had a population that's so mobile. All of these add to the risk profile. And industry, I think industry's starting to get that message. When I look at those numbers I referenced earlier, where 8% 5 years ago said they weren't going to be affected, and now we've got 30% saying, yeah, I might be. So we're starting to get the message, but I think industry also needs to really get a much more structured system working in their production nurseries that can be assessed, evaluated, and the data can be valued. An area we are working on with government is to value grower-generated data. That has to be replicatable, robust, and reportable. And we're working with that. So that values growers doing more, and it gives them that high health status. Thanks, Kerry.
Thanks, John. Bart, you found this in the interviews, didn't you, on the uncertainty and the unknown impacts, especially early on in an incursion. Any comment briefly to make on that one?
I would generally support what John's said. We found all those things through the interviews. As far as uncertainty and unknown impacts, really it's apart from the fact that it's sometimes unavoidable because the early stages, as I mentioned, the authorities are still scrambling to find out what the likely impacts are and understanding the pest and so on and so forth. It's really around, as soon as some information is available or useful information can be provided to growers, that's really important. And it also relates back to that point that growers shouldn't, or the growers we spoke to, that I spoke to, said not to wait around for someone to try and contact you. You have to be proactive in trying to get out there and engage with experts, peers, industry, government, whoever, who can provide you with information. So yeah, that's all I would say on that at this stage, other than to supporting what John just said then.
Yes.
If
That's
I can,
fabulous.
Kerry, I'd just
Yep.
like to add also that industry, when you look at this scenario and what we want to achieve, which is businesses up and trading, if businesses aren't prepared to actually do something, the expectation that I'm really good, therefore government should let me do something, it won't wash. Without evidence, without structure, it won't progress. And this is where we're sort of hitting a bit of a block, I think, with industry, particularly again looking at the data coming out of this report, but also looking back 4 years ago, it was there as well, this assumption that I'm really good and therefore government should just give me everything. It's an underlying thing, and our growers are able to run their businesses and manage their pests and diseases. And I think this is something that might be underpinning some of the thinking. But we've got to get this message to industry that the status quo is not going to be acceptable going into the future to advance where we want to go with business continuity.
Okay, thank you, John. Very valuable. Let's move to scenario number 2. And John mentioned the term supply chain. So what if there was a supply chain interruption to your plant source material? What if that material is compromised or indeed subject to a biosecurity control order? In other words, you cannot obtain it. So what if? What is your risk assessment process to mitigate against that possibility? Who do you need to talk to? What's your information flow to and from authorities and, industry? Do you have alternative suppliers of plant source material? And again, if you can't get it because of a supply chain interruption, what is your time frame before the outage becomes unacceptable to your business? So you can see in each of these situations, we're talking about asking the same sorts of questions. Risk assess, ask who you need to talk to, what's your communication lines, do you have other suppliers or other contacts, and what is your time frame before this outage, this incursion, this interruption to business becomes unacceptable to you, either in supplying your customers or indeed paying staff. So what possible actions could you take? What preparation activities do you need to look at? So what operational processes could you change? Again, who do you need to talk to? And what resources do you need on site to actually supply product, recover production and get back into business? So this is all about supply chain interruption. John, have we had a situation where we've seen, say, plant source material compromised or held up or something like that?
Yeah, absolutely, Kerry. Just about every single incursion that we have. And then, of course, there are the market access protocols that are put in place to allow trade. Depending on almost the day of the week, our government agencies can be efficient or can be appallingly bad. If I take citrus canker in incursion in 2018 in the Northern Territory, that's I almost look at that as the day our system broke. It took something like 12 weeks to get market access protocols in place to allow movement of produce through an agreement across all of the jurisdictions. Noting, of course, that we'd already have a protocol which is under the federal legislation for citrus canker infested regions. It was already there. We just needed to change a few names from the Commonwealth to a state. So we do have issues. Government has a huge role in this. However, we generally are able to, with the progressive government agencies, we're able to engage very constructively and get things going. However, our system allows a degree of bias to come into play, unfortunately, which can interrupt our businesses. We're also, particularly nursery production, we're the beginning of supply chains. So, and we're highly diverse supply chains. So watching over the last 10 years, our supply chains have grown more nationally than they've ever been. And by that, I mean, we are working, our businesses, our professional production nurseries are accessing material that are either under license or plant breeders' rights. You don't have access to this by everybody. So they could be isolated on who has a PBR or a license. And if that jurisdiction goes into a biosecurity lockdown for some reason, I hate that word, go into a incursion response and markets are limited, then they either can't provide that material or they can only provide it to certain areas or at certain times, or it's got to be treated in a certain way. That can all interrupt that supply. And again, it goes back to what I was saying earlier, Kerry. One of the mitigating areas I see working in this space is, once again, all of our businesses operating under structured programs where government will value that information. And if you can prove through good crop monitoring and surveillance data that you don't have that pest, then it's going to be returning to trade and getting moving faster so you can source this material.
Thank you, John. So if we have an interruption to trade, to supply, to our production cycle, it must do some damage to our reputation and our ability to market ourselves and keep ourselves high. So the final scenario we have today is really looking at the potential for reputational damage to either the nursery operator as an individual or to the business itself. So if we look at a situation where there's a threat to business reputation due to the incursion believed to have started in your own nursery, what would you do? What if this did happen? How would you assess the damage it's done to your reputation as a professional nursery operator, as a professional business? How could relationships change? And relationships there is a very broad term, but you think of the wide scope of contacts that you have within the industry and outside the industry, indeed within your own local community. What could you do to actually mitigate the risks? What resources do you need to restore faith from your customers, from your industry, from your local community? And are there any positive outcomes that could actually emerge out of this? I'll hand over to John again and just ask quickly, what could change? What relationships might be impacted by someone being thought to have started an incursion in their nursery?
I think, Kerry, that there's just probably a couple of things. Some of it's actually self-perpetuating. Based on people themselves, they can feel a degree of guilt because they see themselves as being the catalyst for something that's going to move through an industry or industries. That guilt is often misplaced. In my experience, and having done this for 25 years working with industry, I have never had any of our businesses actually been responsible. It's this assumption we make that the first point of contact or identification, we go, oh, well, you're the problem. It's not actually so. So watching our businesses drive that internally, they do it themselves. That is certainly there. I've witnessed that. There's also what I call the de facto blame, and that sort of goes around where you're in an area, and we saw that with red imported fire ant. Businesses in other jurisdictions just simply said, you're in that area, so we're not going to buy from you. So growers start to feel that whole side that they're responsible for something when in actual fact they're not. And I think probably the other side is that industry needs to we need to mature. And that, I mean that by horticulture needs to mature. We need to not necessarily focus on blame. We need to focus on getting rid of the thing and working it through and give people the benefit of the doubt. It's I know we like to find a reason for something, but sometimes we don't. In so many of the incursions that we've had in the last 20 years, we've never been able to establish with absolute certainty pathways, that introduction pathway. So I think we need to industries need to grow and understand that, and that's up to us as peak bodies communicating that. We often can't get these people that have been affected. We can't get them to talk to industry. We wish we could, so they could actually talk about it, because the industry does get in behind and support people that are adversely impacted by other natural disasters, cyclones, flooding, all of those things. But when it comes to this sort of a natural disaster or an emergency, our industry looks for blame. And then probably the other one I witnessed is actually it came out of the response. There was what we call a breach of confidentiality in a certain response, and that didn't do our grower a lot of good. And that there was quite an aggressive response from an industry, and actually a client being very aggressive, did not help the situation with that grower, who at no point did the authorities ever put them down as being the introductory pathway. Thanks, Gary.
Thanks, John. We have about just 1 minute to go. I might just open it up to Liz or Bart to comment on if you have any thoughts on the reputational damage before we open it up to any questions.
Oh, I had not a question related to this, but for John, when you say that to encourage nursery growers to raise the bar on what they're doing, that government needs to start valuing what they do. What do you mean by that? Like specifically, how would they show that they're valuing?
Oh, one of the areas that there's a few, but one of the areas that we're talking to them government about. Government wants to see industry do better in the biosecurity space. Now that all comes down to government's lack of capacity, capability, funding, but also elevated risk I spoke about. I mean, there are certain scenarios where no matter how much money we have, it's not going to do things. Industry actually needs to take this and take ownership. We need government to allow that to happen. So government talks about shared responsibility, industry doing more, etc. If you look at the surveys that we've done over the years, most of industry sits there believing that it's only being handed off to the things government doesn't want. We actually want government to turn this around and value what our growers do. If government wants our industry to participate in national pest surveillance and provide data, which then provides evidence of absence of a pest, which then facilitates our national trade, why won't those same governments recognise that same data being generated by those same people for our domestic system? We've got a lot of, as I said, bias comes into play, both personal and professional and institutional. At the moment, we see significant institutional bias through our state regulators. They want, at the higher levels, government want us to be doing things as industry, but as you filter down through the bureaucracy, you get stopped. And that's where we've got these problems. Simple valuing that data. If it's valued and can be shown that a certain pest is not on that property, that business should be allowed to get back to trade straight away. And utilising other aspects of what our industry does as well. Expertise, all of those other things.
Thanks, John. Great question, Liz. Thank you very much. All right, well, we have come to the end of the session, and I'll just check in with David to see if we have any questions, comments.
No, there was one comment there by Colin earlier on that said diversification would take time, so a longer concept is needed. But I think John covered on the reasons why diversification is stifled in some cases. But apart from that, no, no other questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. You'll receive a copy of this recording probably early in the next few days. So thank you very much. We have our contacts there if you want to know more. We have the reports. They will be going up onto the APPS website very soon. And also you can contact me directly through that email address. And of course, this is funded through the Nursery Industry Levy through Hort Innovations. So we thank everyone so much today for joining us. Thank you to our panelists, Liz, Bart from CSIRO. John, thank you very much for your insights and expertise, and indeed many, many years of service to this industry. David, thank you very much for monitoring the chat and helping with setup, and we will see you soon. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you, Kerry.
Thanks, Kerry.
Bye.
Okay.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Kerry. Right.